the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we're sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we begin today's discussion, we do briefly want to mention we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We are making available our Discord server. Taylor's leading some reading groups. We're recording that audio and putting that up on Patreon as well. And so, we're offering some benefits now. So, keep that in mind if you're enjoying the show. Today, we are diving back into 1,000 Plateaus with a look at the Postulates of Linguistics.
Yes, the fourth plateau. And I do think it's cool.
What's the date? The date is November 20th, 1923.
Yes. So
you mentioned this last time, I think.
The dates are interesting. I think that's one of the things that they that singularizes the plateaus. See, the interesting thing, right, is that each plateau kind of feeds into and bleeds into each other, right? This is how they construct a rhizome. I know that Deleuze, when he thinks back on writing this with Guattari, he talks about how in the writing process, certain lines from one plateau, like ants, would migrate to other plateaus. But to a certain extent, they say that you can pick up a plateau at any point and it could just as well be in any other plateau. Obviously, there are going to be themes for each plateau, and that's why it is interesting that each plateau is dated, which gives it a kind of singularity. This date is interesting. Now, I saw that there's an edited volume that came out a few years ago. It's edited by one of our friends, Henry Summers Hall, Jeffrey Bell. He's been on the show. He edited it, and then one other editor. I feel bad for leaving them out, but each plateau is assigned an author. So you got like Dan Smith, Ronald Bogue, even Ray Brazier contributed to.
Nice.
But Jeffrey Bell does a reading of the fourth plateau, and I think the book is called 1,000 Plateaus in Philosophy. If you guys are listening out there, pick it up. It's a great companion piece because 1,000 Plateaus is an immense undertaking to read, and it can give you some insight. I think he does a good job of unpacking this date. He looks at various books in economics and economic history and shows how, basically leading up to November 20th, there is this high inflation in Germany, and not just in Germany, as we know, right? In Europe, obviously, we would have our Great Depression as well a little bit later in America. But so there is this constant this shift from the Reichsmark to the Rentenmark. So a literal creation of a new money supply. And the Rentenmark basically was, I don't know if it was not backed up by gold, kind of like how we moved off the gold standard in the 70s. But I think that basically these notes, they ended up having to print billions of paper notes because of the way that inflation was rapidly rising. And it reminds me a little bit, Coop, of that, that section in libidinal economy where
the cheesemonger.
The cheesemonger, as Jeffrey Bell shows in his companion piece in that book I mentioned on this plateau, that workers would be paid in this new currency, and they would rush to go to go use it to buy, food supplies to survive because of that's how fast inflation was. So literally, minutes or hours of being paid, their paycheck is, or their little payment, their these paper marks were losing substantial amounts of value. And so I think that's he does a good job kind of expand, because they don't spend too much time looking at this. They do obviously talk about it and mention it. They also mention another date which could just as well feature here, July 4th, 1917. They mention, as I was telling you, I read it yesterday. You can find it on Marxist.org. Lenin's piece translated as "on slogans," which in French is apropos de mode, the order, right? So on order words is how Deleuze and Guattari might translate it. Because I mentioned to you one of the ways to translate that phrase, mot d'ordre, is order, which they have taken literally as order words, could be translated as slogan. So that's another you could append here, where Lenin takes a slogan like "all power to the Soviets," how that could have been possible between February and July 4th of 1917, but the revolution's been betrayed. There's the Soviets have basically become complicit, or not complicit maybe, but at least complacent, and there's no longer an ability for a peaceful transfer of power, and so there has to be a kind of violent revolution, and new class categories have to be proposed. And that's why Deleuze and Guattari kind of say in Lenin's text there is a kind of incorporeal transformation being called upon for these new class categories to be attributed to bodies. That's just looking ahead a little bit, but that does give a little bit of context for the date for this plateau. And I do think that each plateau, we should look at the dates. Like the next one's going to be interesting because it's not any one day, but it's 587 BC to 70 AD. So that's going to be about the temple in Jerusalem. So, I mean, so some dates are but we also saw in Plateau 3, 10,000 BC. That's kind of an interesting date. But some of these dates will have like a very specific or smaller time frame. And yeah. But I will say another thing before we start, and I'll let you speak, is they have 4 sections in this 4th plateau. And the way that Masumi translates it is to put it in the declarative and to put each section in quotation marks, like scare quotes.
Mm-hmm.
In the French, it's in the conditional. So I think Masumi's translating this has handled this by putting it in quotes, but the main thrust of the meaning is the same, where Deleuze and Guattari are, let's say, having I don't want to call it a debate, but an argument maybe with the dominant position of linguistics, right? So linguistics tells us that language is informational and communicational, and that's on the very first page 75. In the French, if you translate it more literally, it would be language would be informational and communicational. And of course, they're going to say, no, that's not right. Right. So each of these sections is going to be basically tied from the perspective of dominant linguistics. Here's what they would say. And we have to take that as they're going to propose the alternative path that's going to reject that as the basis for their theory.
So one of the big things that, I mean, it's really I think the look at linguistics begins the chapter, but then they like transition over to, I think, very skillfully, maybe, to like this critique of science.
Yes, they bring up the critique of science. They don't go into, but you're right. They bring up the major minor. Oh wait, you mean Sorry, I'm anticipating. You meant their critique of how linguistics thinks it needs to proceed to be a science, and that science is complicit. Always already presupposes a political order. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, they start with the focus on, I think, this misguided scientism or scientific quote unquote approach to linguistics, which they critique by saying, they're looking for linguistics are looking for constants and universals, and they're eliding like the dynamism and the kind of the like the imminent features of language that really, right, it's like the pragmatics to some degree, I think, touches on that, because it's like the focus on how language is actually used in practice rather than the sort of transcendental. And I mean, that's ultimately I think the real germ of critique here goes back to Deleuze's real uh, critique of the image of thought, I think.
Yes, that's a good point.
Just in the way that he discusses, I mean, this goes more towards the critique of science, specifically in the way that, well, I guess it can go both ways, actually, because the way that I was just discussing their critique of traditional, let's say, linguistics as this, what do they call it? Imperialism. Linguistics is an imperialism or something like that.
That's what Guattari says in the Machinic Unconscious. Gotcha. But they at least, even if that line, that's the literal line, he puts an exclamation point, right? He says linguists are imperialists, and then he adds they're not the only ones. But
gotcha.
but his main point is that at least his pushback is against the way in which linguistics would claim that language covers everything. And if you remember a little bit, or would cover all the strata, for example, and if you remember in the Geology of Morals, they deny that language is omnipresent with the strata. And they go even as far as to suggest that perhaps signs aren't found on all the strata. That maybe if you push deterritorialization enough, if you get close enough to the abstract machine, even signs would be indistinguishable from certain other features. But in any case,
interesting.
You're right about the image of thought too, that there is an image of thought where linguistics would claim. See, this is the paradox, right? And Chomsky is bullied here, just as he is in Machinic Unconscious, and rightfully so. But also Saussure is bullied because Chomsky and Saussure and the dominant linguists, we'll call them major, right? The quote unquote majoritarian linguistics will say, of course, language really is a heterogeneous, multifaceted thing, but we can't study that, right? We have to homogenize it, stabilize it, and extract constants from it,
right?
In order to, that's what we can study.
Right,
and Deleuze and Guattari are like, that's bullshit. That in fact, that in one and the same movement, you are not just, you're quote unquote doing pure science by homogenizing a system, but at the one and the same time, you are also setting up the majoritarian standards of a standardized language. So for them, to say this is a purely scientific maneuver is would be false. That they would say no, it's always already a political choice to do that to language, to freeze frame it, so to speak,
to remove the subjective components and the actual expression of, or not the expression, but the actualization of language, which it's in itself, right? That's the kind of paradigm for science that is constrained by its own disavowal of the subjective
Well, I would
components.
maybe not the subjective. The word you were using earlier, the pragmatic, the practical components, which could be individual or collective, and I think this is why they seemed. This is not their main point, but they seem to want to get rid of the speech language distinction that Saussure sets up, and that seems to be, again, a position of majoritarian linguistics. So it's not so much about the subjective factors, but about the fact that, as you mentioned, I mean, and this again, Chomsky does it. He's not the only one, where pragmatics would have to be thrown to the wayside because it would ruin this homogenized system that would set up the constants, right? The practical factors would be seen as non-linguistic, whereas Deleuze and Guattari, or Guattari wants to say specifically in Machine and Conscious, that actually pragmatics is the expansive discipline, and linguistics is a very, in the sense in which we're talking about majoritarian linguistics, is a very circumscribed subset. So it's not so much about the objective and the subjective, I think, right? It's because, as they say, well, and this is why I think they start with talking about the order word and redundancy. So you can have redundancy of resonance and redundancy of frequency. One would, let's look at that page. This is on page 79, right? So frequency would be more about the play of signifiers and information, whereas resonance would be about subjectivity and communication. And so they're going to want to reject both of those as that neither of those gets to the heart of language for them, insofar as they say that the order word is more fundamental.
I guess I was more so thinking about just in the broader sense of science, what science, like what major majoritarian science tries to do is remove the subjective components, right? Because it's only looking at or like,
well, it would look at grammatical subjects. Maybe that's what you're trying to say.
I mean, I was thinking just like even like zooming out from specifically linguistics, just like the general thrust of science is to, it's right because it's an objective science.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Versus
I think,
the like, so the pragmatic actual lived, again, it's this, again, it ultimately goes back to this, I think the issue of transcendence being really what the bugaboo is, right? Like that's the fly in the ointment, so to speak. To me, that's what kind of stands out here is like, and by that, it's like by conducting science in this way, or what's like having this prejudice towards that type of a scientific endeavor constrains thought, and it constrains possibilities, because it's almost like where you might say something like, oh, I didn't know I couldn't do that. But that would be the reverse, I think, right? Because it's like, oh, well, it doesn't occur to a scientist to look at X as X, because they are stuck in an image of thought that excludes the pragmatic or the
explicitly political, right?
Right.
I mean,
that too, right?
I mean, I think that's why if language can be considered informational or communicational, right? And to a certain extent, those are convertible into one another. Then we immediately are stuck within a realm, almost like a hermeneutic realm of meaning, and a sort of asepticized play of signifiers, almost like a parody of Lacan. And we don't see, I think, as they're saying, we bracket out the actual political effects, what they call order words, that that language is committed to. I mean, and to a certain extent, I mean, your thing about image of thought is great because it goes back, as we say, we could look back at Deleuze's early work, which is less seemingly political, but when he reads someone like Bergson, even if Bergson will not extract a politics from this, he sees language first and foremost as to use a term outside of its context as performative. Language is action oriented. It's about getting things done, right? It has an instrumental utilitarian value, and I think that's partly why that's partly why it aligns on the side of his critique of science, right? Because linguistics wants to, linguistics wants to see effects as though it's always happening in language and make this hard line between what would not be language. And you see that Deleuze and Guattari, and this is Deleuze trying to say, okay, so you have bodies, you have the actions and passions of bodies, but you also have incorporeal transformations. And to a certain extent, if we leave out, if we sort of cleave one or the other to make a subject object type of distinction, which again I think is a product of our grammar, at least Western grammar, and the way that sentences are broken up into subject and predicate. I think that it's easy to botch the side of what they call the, you've got the machinic assemblage, which would more or less be, they call it, that's quote unquote content, but that would be on the side of bodies, right? But you also have the collective assemblage of enunciation, which is the incorporeal transformations, which is what Deleuze used to call events, right? Stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
If you fuck up both sides of it, you're never gonna kind of see. You're gonna fuck up the assemblage, right? You're gonna fuck up one side or the other, probably both at the same time. And I think that that's the other thing that. But yeah, I guess that's the question. For them, as we'll see later. Constants and variables are not the issue. The issue is not so much about privileging variables over constants, even though what's important to see is that constants are extracted from variables rather than constants sort of being given, God given, or as you mentioned, the bugaboo is transcendence. If we take constants as primary, then of course variation just seems like it would be external to linguistics and what they would study. Whereas I think that they see that if we understand language is always in motion and in variation, to extract constants from the variables is always to do a political maneuver. And that's what's being done. A political maneuver's choice is being made in order to quote unquote do science. So
I don't know if this necessarily tracks with what you're getting at, but I really thought this variation being systematic, variation is systematic versus I think the reverse of that, I thought was kind of an interesting way to kind of flip the paradigm as far as linguistics are concerned.
Yes, this is their privileging. For example, I mean, they make it out to be a disagreement between Chomsky and William Labov. I'm not exactly sure how to. And they privilege him. They in the footnotes they cite a couple of his works. I haven't read him before, but Labov is basically pushing back against Chomsky and saying, yes, variation is what is systematic. The fact that language is constantly varying and constantly shifting and constantly, it's something that's lived. It's alive. I mean, I suppose the only way for a language to become quote unquote constant would be for it to be like a dead language, like Latin, right? Uh, but even then, Latin lives on in in various languages. Think about like terms like a priori or ad hoc or ad hominem. It
Yeah.
continues to live on this kind of weird afterlife that sure, those meanings are more or less stable, but to a certain extent, um, you know, it's only when a language is has ossified, has died, right? Kind of like fully uh, reached all of its possibilities. I may have cut you off, but we were talking about variation. The variation is what's systematic, not constant. Obviously, the constants have been systematized and have been sort of chosen for the linguist's benefit, but that's at the cost of ossifying language as though it were already dead, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. I was kind of interestingly, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a detour. No, it is a literal detour, but you mentioned predicate, and I was just thinking about the Latin, whatever the Latin pred having to do with like it almost brings prediction to mind, for example, for a
Mm-hmm.
predicate, which you know what I mean? Because the the answer to the question being presupposed by the question or something like that, right? I don't know if I worded that accurately or if I have that correct, but it's something like that, right? As far as
Yeah,
subject predicate, they get
the
into this a bit if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, something that is predicative is, I mean, literally it's a saying beforehand, right? It's something that is said of something else, right? Um, so it's ascribed to the subject, and that's just how our grammar sort of functions, right? When we're dividing things up that way. And in terms of prediction, yes, it's said beforehand in the sense in which it is.
I mean, prediction, right? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
like it's
yeah,
almost too on the nose.
yeah. So, and I do think that this is why this is why towards the end we get back to something they already said in the first plateau or the introduction rhizome, where we see this what Deleuze wants to shift, and of course in French it's a homophone from is or a to and, which you subtract the s, right? So est to et. So Deleuze, they bring back up in this plateau the shift from is to and, because in Western languages, for the most part, the copula, the is gluing together the subject and the predicate, whereas in other languages, it's a slightly different ontology, to use the word, right? It's not necessarily centered around the infinitive to be, um, or even like uh, the way in which you could say, I've heard it described this way, and again, I'm not a Eastern language specialist, but there's a way in which there's almost a kind of more or less linearized form of the sentence with the subject, verb, and the rest of the predicate versus in Eastern language, where I've heard it's more event oriented and centered. I would definitely want a Deleuzian scholar with a background in Eastern languages to maybe draw out this overturning of the verb is for the conjunction and, which for Deleuze and Guattari, they say that and is less of a conjunction and more of a junction, because it's not like overcoding, it's overthrowing is, et cetera, right?
It'd be interesting. I don't know if this is quite. It feels like it might be relevant. Would be the difference between inflected and non-inflected languages.
Hmm.
because I think there is a similar, like, I think Mandarin is non-inflected,
Okay.
for example, and I think that may track with what you're saying, but I'm not that schooled in and all of this
No,
sort of stuff in linguistics and maybe linguistic anthropology to be able to speak
we would need to defer
authoritatively, yeah, but
to experts on that.
it'd be interesting. I did take a linguistic anthropology class, which was quite fascinating. But I mean, we discussed Chomsky's universal grammar and like some of
Mhm.
the physiological structures in the brain, like the Broca, and I forget the other part. Because there's Broca's aphasia and blah blah blah. So I forget what the other component part is, but that's irrelevant. I don't know. I didn't find this plateau to be that interesting overall. So I don't know. I might let you kind of drive the topics at least.
Well, we mentioned a little bit about the order word, right? Their example is they, as opposed to information science, where they say, um, there. Let me see if I can find it. Language is made not to be believed, but to be obeyed and to compel obedience. Information is only the strict minimum necessary for the emission, transmission, and observation of orders as commands. Um, which overturns like information science, where uh, the there's a sort of a maximum of information that's only sort of the subtracting from that is only to sort of rule out noise. And I think for them, um, it's about, well, I mean, the way that Axel Chernyavsky says it in his book on the creation of concepts is that language not just gives orders, right, to other humans, but is about ordering in the sense of giving consistency to
That's good.
constituting experience. And so this gets to the virtual aspect. But I guess, for the most part here, I do think we also need to understand it literally in the same sense in which I said they were taking a common phrase in French, mot d'ordre, slogan, and taking it and making a concept out of it, making it literal. And so like, um, this is why I think they go to free and direct discourse, or the illocutionary, where they say language, it's not content to just go from something seen or felt, but from saying to saying. And this is why they turn to Bonveniste, which I think is a really interesting thing, where, okay, so, about the different bees, and if they find different bees go out from the hive and they find a source of food and they come back and they do little dances,
Right.
Depending on the bee species, they'll do a dance, and the dance itself, depending on the number of rotations and etc., encodes in the dance the direction and the distance to that source of food.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bonveniste says, okay, this is a great code and very useful, but it's not a language because, and I didn't know this until this plateau, and I'd more or less forgotten it until rereading it. The reason why this is not a language is that um, the one who has seen the source of the food and come back and danced can give that information, quote unquote. This is maybe why a code could be perhaps informational and communicational, but not a language. But in any case, that first bee can tell the other bees where the source is and the direction. But the other bees can't then go and tell still other bees. They would have to have seen it themselves, right? So to speak. So it's interesting that that that's why I think they put so much emphasis on the quote unquote illocutionary, because it's not just about what I've seen, what I've heard, but not just what I've seen personally and felt personally. It's like rumor or gossip or hearsay, right? It can echo out and to those who haven't seen or felt the original impulse. So I think that's part of its superlinearity, so to speak, when they use that expression, when they call language superlinear, right? That's one aspect of it. And I will say, let's see. The other thing that's interesting to me, and Guattari will do more of this in Machine Unconscious, and we'll see these terms come back, but emphasizing redundancy. We'll see this come back in Plateau 5, but they will say in Plateau 5, the sign is redundant with the sign. So there's a certain presupposed redundancy that I think this is, again, part of the overturning of information theory, at least in the Shannon and Weaver sense, because one of the ways that information science first developed was to say, like, given, say, our alphabet of 26 letters, the the rarest of the letters has the most information because it's sort of unexpected, right? So an X, or let's say a Q, especially a Q not followed by a U, would be of higher information output than an E, which would be the most frequent occurrence, right?
That's fucking interesting, man.
That's fucking interesting, man. And so for them, they shift, they sort of reverse perspectives and say, no, in fact, redundancy is primary and not just an after effect or a sort of it's the redundancy that's important, because the redundancy makes sure that you have just amount of differentiation, or you retain or process just enough information or communication to not confuse orders, right? They give the example of fire and for, which is funny. We could choose all kinds of different examples, but you have to, I think this is also too why and this is something that's straight out of Guattari's Machine of Unconscious, which was published in 79, the year prior to the publication of this book. Guattari says something that they say in this Plateau just as well, where subjects are supposed to have a minimum amount of grammatical knowledge in order to submit to the laws on the books. If you don't have that grammatical capability, then you're going to be institutionalized, right? You'll be at best you'll be provided with those tools of that minimum, as I said, of processing information so you can submit to law, to order words, or you'll be forever institutionalized, one can imagine, at worst.
Yeah, that example brings it into sharper relief, I think, the significance of it.
And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Oh no, I didn't have anything.
Well, I mean, we see this emphasis on grammaticality to play out in. I mean, we were just talking about subjects and predicates, and obviously for Deleuze in his solo work before this, the infinitive is, and it'll come back up in this book too. The infinitive is the mode of the event, right? All other tenses kind of is the time of chronos, is the time of bodies, the actions and passions of bodies, but the infinitive is he reserves for the event alone, which would relate to incorporeal transformations. And they defined the acts, the speech acts, in relation to the order word. They say these acts seem to be defined as the set of all incorporeal transformations current in a given society and attributed to the bodies of that society. Right? So they give the example of I swear, or a judge saying guilty. Those pertain to bodies, the actions and passions of bodies, right? The body of the condemned, for example. But the instantaneous transformation that's incorporeal after the judge slams his gavel and says guilty, that sets up a whole transformation of the body of the condemned, right? Mm-hmm. Beforehand, it's innocent until proven guilty or whatever, right? Now, of course, they do argue that there has to be a kind of correspondence, right, between bodies and incorporeal transformations. We can't just go out into a grocery store and yell guilty and carry out the same kind of effectuation. This is their way of talking about it. There has to be effectuable or effectuated variables, right? So in a courtroom, in a legal courtroom, legal proceeding at the end of which is pronounced guilty, not guilty, or I'm sure there's several other outcomes like a hung jury or a mistrial or blah blah blah. But so obviously there has to be an alignment, so to speak, of bodies and or the actions and passions of bodies and the speech acts that can attribute these transformations to them. That just kind of makes sense, but it's worth stating. As they said, the statement "I love you" or "I swear" is different in all kinds of different situations, right? In saying "I swear," the child saying it to the parent, or the lover saying it to the beloved, or saying it in a courtroom. Again, to use that. And I do think that the courtroom as an example is really important because it hits home again how this is first and foremost about power, about there is a political dynamism to speech acts and performatives and order words, right. It's not secondary or happenstance. It's sort of part and parcel of things.
There's one can be compelled to speech in the courtroom. One can be silenced in the courtroom as well. So yeah.
And this is why there's a right to like Fifth Amendment, right? Well, against self-incrimination, right? But you're right. There's and then of course one can be punished for the things one says under oath, right? Even taking an oath is
perjury, right? Oh yeah, that's another.
But taking an oath is like I said, I swear. Taking an oath,
right,
is an incorporeal transformation that can subject us to different forms of power. We kind of already talked about the second section, which is, quote, "There is an abstract machine of language that does not appeal to any extrinsic factor." And I think for them, and this is why it's important, as they want to distinguish between content and expression, which would include on each side, each side would have substance and form, right? So there's a form of expression, a form of content. But I think that we talked about this. We started by talking about this to a certain extent by saying that linguistics wants to make a hard line distinction between that which would, for example, all these political dimensions of language, or its internal variations, etc. Those would not be properly scientific things to study. And I think that Deleuze and Guattari find this obviously absurd. And in any case, even if on the one hand, language would obviously have an extrinsic dimension, it also has an intrinsic one. There's an intrinsic immanent variability of order words and statements. And it's in this section where they make the distinction within the assemblage with like a capital A between the machinic assemblage of bodies, actions and passions, intermingling of bodies, and then the collective assemblage of enunciation of acts and statements and corporeal transformations. They turn to Kafka and look at Kafka, but it's interesting that if for them in the assemblage, and it's nice that they finally come to it because they've been using this language for the past 3 plateaus, but in the assemblage, we could say with a capital A, they think of it as a tetra. They literally say tetravalence of the assemblage, right? So you can almost make a meme out of it where you know the political grids, right? Where do you fall on the political axis? You can see that there's an X and a Y axis that would cut up 4 domains, we can imagine. And the assemblage would have on the one side, obviously, its machinic side, bodies, actions and passions. And then it would have the collective assemblage, so acts, incorporeal transformation, order words, etc. And that's 2 sides, but we could maybe do that on the horizontal. On the vertical, there's also territorial sides or reterritorialized sides, which stabilize it. This would be constants, right? If we extract constants from language, that would be a vector on the territorialized, reterritorialized side. But there's also cutting edges of deterritorialization, which carry it away. Now, this is important, especially when we get to the fourth section of Plateau 4, because they're going to say, and this gets to the conversation we had with Eugene Holland, where it's not enough, or it's not, when they are really wanting to promote the minorization of language. And this is why I think they make a claim that I'll say more about, where it's not major and minor modes of language. It's not about 2 languages. It's not about a major language and a minor language. It's about 2 different usages and functions of language. There's a major use and major function of language. There's a minor use and a minor function of language. So it's not 2 languages. It's two different aspects. And this is really important for them, and they'll make good arguments for it. But just to anticipate, we can imagine this is they don't want to say that it's good enough for minor languages to advocate to be to take on a major status.
Right. Yeah.
That for them, that I think that for them, on the one hand, that's going to happen no matter what. Right. I mean, on the one hand, that's going to be a something that there's always going to be that reterritorializing effect, like a Chomsky the major mode of linguistics is always going to be able to extract constants from minor dialects or secret languages, right? There's always going to be a structuralization and homogenization that can be applied to it, and that it may more or less sometimes tend towards a kind of stabilization, which again for them it's the center of gravity around which these stabilizations occur are always political. They're not sort of some sort of ideal point. They suggest instead it's the deterritorialization of the standard, of the major, that characterizes true minoritarian becomings, right?
Yeah.
There's no becoming majoritarian for them. They say that very clearly in this plateau, and they will echo it throughout the other plateaus. That is it for them. That's a contradiction in terms, and we'll be able to see as we get deeper into the 1,000 plateaus why that is. And I think that what's important here is that I think that it has to do for them, and they use the 2 words that I think we talked a little bit about with Holland. They think about the extractions of constants and the imposition of a majoritarian mode of language stabilized around a pouvoir, a power. Pouvoir,
power over is pouvoir, right?
Power over is how Eugene Holland parses that. But yes, it's a.
But puissance is not power with.
So power. So Eugene Holland also translates puissance as power with. So so against the pouvoir of domination, of the domination of majoritarian mode, and constant, they put forward the puissance of variation, right? Of variability and variation. So in the tetravalence, just to recapitulate, the machinic assemblage, the machinic side, bodies, actions, and passions. On the collective assemblage of enunciation side, you got acts and statements, incorporeal transformations, what Deleuze and Guattari, or what Deleuze would have called, and he still uses the language a little bit, events, right? So bodies and events. That's one side of that's the x-axis, and then the y-axis would be territorializing or re-territorializing vector tendency and the cutting edges of deterritorialization. And I think that they mean this for any and all assemblages. So it's at least if this plateau didn't like get you aroused, at least we can take we can take from that we could easily map, theoretically we could easily map any assemblage in that way, right? We being able to distinguish bodies and their actions and passions, and then events or incorporeal transformations on one side, deterritorialization, re-territorialization on the other. And they give the example of the feudal assemblage, right? This is on page 89, where they say the tetravalence of the assemblage. Taking the feudal assemblage as an example, we would have to consider the interminglings of bodies defining feudalism: the body of the earth and the social body, the body of the overlord, vassal, and serf, the body of the knight and the horse and their new relation to the stirrup, the weapons and tools, assuring a symbiosis of bodies, a whole machinic assemblage. We would also have to consider statements, expressions, the juridical regime of heraldry, all of the incorporeal transformations in particular, oaths and their variables, the oath of obedience, but also the oath of love.
Interesting.
And then they end the collective assemblage of enunciation, right? And then they say on the other axis, we would have to consider the feudal territorialities and re-territorializations, and at the same time, the line of deterritorialization that carries away both the knight and his mount statements and acts. We'd have to consider how all of this combines in the Crusades. Now, this is a very crystallized example, and they will come back to this question of the Crusades, of the knight, of the feudal assemblage throughout the forthcoming plateaus for us to look at. But it's good here, I think, that we can already have a very snapshot view of being able to take an assemblage and look at it on a horizontal level of bodies and events, or bodies and statements, and then the vectors of deterritorialization and re-territorialization, and so I think that here they're trying to do something like that with the order word, which is attributed or has effects on bodies, right? So we can think about bodies and statements with the order word, and I do think that there's a way in which here I think that the way that they're going would be that on the re-territorialization and deterritorialization side, on the re-territorialization side, as we see at the end of this plateau, there's the death sentence, the little death contained in each order word. And they draw upon Canetti and Crowds and Powers, Crowds and Power, where I don't know if you saw this in the footnote, but it's kind of a beautiful passage that they cite, where Canetti is talking about how every order sort of wounds and scars us, and we sort of it forms this cyst, and then that's the basis for giving. It has to be passed on, otherwise it kind of becomes cancerous and consumes us. And so we pass on the order, the little death sentence, as Deleuze and Guattari say, to others, in order to discharge that that wound. And this is why, based on this analysis, like the Nazis who were following orders, but also carrying them out and doing it to others, didn't necessarily feel remorse, because it's carrying out this necessary movement and not something that comes from our own desires and wills, right? Hurt people, right? I'm sure you've heard that statement. That truism, though, I think is pretty much exemplifying this question. And so underneath that reterritorialized side of the death sentence implied by order words, they suggest there might be a possibility of finding the passwords underneath order words or inherent in order words, and to maybe elaborate the passwords beneath order words. And that anticipates a notion that we'll see later in terms of components of passage, rather than order words, which are stoppages and blockages. Okay, let's move on.
Well,
go ahead. No, please.
I did want to just mention briefly that I mentioned this to you earlier, but I want to share with the audience that I thought that this discussion, the way that they discuss minor and major modes here and tie it to music, really, I think was it was like it really helped the conceptual, like the non-oppositional or like non-distinctness of them make a lot more sense. I don't know, just fleshed out
how they feed into each other, right?
It rounded out those concepts in a far more elucidatory way than, we've discussed that shit 1,000 times on the show before, right? Like minoritarian, major, minor modes, etc. Like that's been a common refrain, but I never really grasped it in the context of the minor and major, like scales or what have you, in musical theory, which I think is really quite fascinating and really shows what they're really getting at in a way that it's kind of like this non-oppositional. It's almost like non-philosophy is non-oppositional philosophy. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
because it sounds like it's this duality or this like binary opposition, for example.
Well, it is interesting that most of the popular music, the music that sells on the market, we could most likely, I would assume most of it we could.
Right. Yeah, it's going to be major scale for.
It's going to be in a major scale, maybe 4 chords, something like this, right? If we wanted to keep ensconcing it into a kind of redundancy or a kind of basic template, the majoritarian model,
the form, the preeminence or prominence of the form of the four time signature, etc. Yeah, that too. Even
4/4, 4/4. Which you may not hear as much waltz time signatures these days. Although at a certain point in time, the waltz would have been very popular.
Some wild shit too, man. If you played that for your parents, they'd have been like, "No, dog, we can't."
But you're right about the minor mode and the way in which it's the major and the minor modes. It's not that necessarily that they use different notes, as you were telling me, Coop. It's the intervals between the scales, or the way in which a scale comes to completion and fruition.
Between the notes, I think specifically, like but again, I'm out of the
intervals. No, I guess the intervals in the way of in the way in which the gaps are treated is different, right, than in the major and the minor.
Yeah,
mode,
I don't even really concretely understand the mechanics of it, unfortunately. But I really wonder if there's like something super in depth and interesting to dive into relative to that notion of the interval itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, relating to the theory and the philosophy present in this particular plateau.
But it is interesting that the one of the reasons perhaps why the major predominates is it has a certain affective range.
Yeah, like the redundancy element, because doesn't Guattari highlight music as the art form that has the highest redundancy of resonance or what have you?
Well, I know that at a certain point, when we get to the refrain plateau, and maybe by then we'll have done some of our research into the stuff that we're just speculating about, right? I claim ignorance as well on this front, but Guattari, it's specifically in Machine of Unconscious when he's reading the Proust, when he's reading Proust's novel, and he's applying all of this, these theoretical creations that to the novel as a way of reading it. He and we see this in the refrain plateau, but the what he comes up with is that music is perhaps like the most deterritorialized form of art, and perhaps that's why it has a certain role to play in Proust that maybe can't as easily be played by visual art, for example. And it's not that necessarily one's better than the other, right? This would be perhaps a mistake to make, but that it can have a certain it can effectuate certain things, bring
Yeah.
about certain things that that perhaps
I mean, maybe music is,
image.
it feels like music is really the closer is more, yeah, like the intensity of the affect that you can generate with music is just, I mean, it seems far greater than any other form of art, just right. Like,
The question would be: is it far greater or is it more instantaneous? Right? Is it has more of an immediacy, perhaps?
perhaps, yeah.
That's the hard part to know about, because I do think that for Deleuze and Guattari, and we'll see some of their statements upon this later, the speed at which a deterritorialization comes about may not necessarily be the most intense. So it's kind of a question of, if music is the most deterritorialized, does that mean it's the greatest vector of deterritorialization and the most intense? It's hard to say, and it can't always be related just back to how it affects us. And not I'm not saying music or art per se. I mean deterritorialization in general. So these are questions that we'll leave open and think about. But in terms of music's redundancy, I mean, you're right. I mean, even with 12 tone serialism beyond sort of the classical Western majoritarian model, that still doesn't leave us with that many, on the one hand, that many bass notes, but on the other hand, there is still an infinite uh, variation that's possible, even with playing the same notes in succession, depending on uh, various ways of the way that, as you said, variation is the theme, right? So yes, on the one hand, redundant, but that doesn't prevent variation and infinite variation, as they will start to call it later. Um,
It's
they're only hinting at what they will call infinite or continuous variation here. Well, I think continuous variation is the language they use here, but later they will start bringing out infinite variation. But go ahead, Coop. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to make a dumb comment about how you're you were thinking about 12 tone serialism, and I'm thinking about like Neil Diamond and Sweet Caroline coming on at a
Oh,
football
okay.
game or something.
So you were thinking about less the notes redundancy, but maybe the way a song can become popularized and played and even sometimes overplayed, perhaps, or not.
Yeah, I don't really know what I don't know if I had a really good something to tie it back to it, but it feels like, I don't know. There are those songs that really, I don't know, in a communal setting, like people really love that. I feel like there's been
The arena rock.
a million, no, there's been like a million jokes about, the Neil Diamond song, like Sweet Caroline. It'll be like white people whenever Sweet Caroline comes
Okay,
on, you know what I
okay,
mean? And it's
okay.
like
I see.
that sort of thing. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. Maybe I was
Well,
thinking about the affect component of music there. Maybe that was the little germ I was thinking about.
it's definitely. I mean, music definitely has a role to play in ritual, as we know, right? I mean, and So it makes sense that it could also veer towards because obviously I think when Deleuze and Guattari say the term or conceive the concept of redundancy here to qualify language, and they're not necessarily using it in a pejorative sense, but I think maybe you're thinking of there obviously redundancy normally when we think about it in everyday sense, it's always pejorative, right? When something's redundant, it's either not necessary and can be removed, or it's mediocre, or it's played out and hackneyed and
Yeah. Right.
unoriginal.
Cliche.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at least in this plateau, in this context, and we'll see in the next one, redundancy is something functional and not, it doesn't have a value related to it. I will say there's something interesting on 91 where at the very bottom, and this is maybe will be important for later. At most, we may distinguish in the abstract machine two states of the diagram. And it's important to note that the abstract machine, they define it as the diagram of the assemblage, because we were talking about the tetravalence, right? The four aspects, deterritorialization, reterritorialization, machinic assemblage, collective assemblage of enunciation. So if we could diagram an assemblage, and I do think we'll also have to shift what we mean by diagram. Hopefully our discussion with Rocky helped a little bit there, right? When we talked to him about the diagram and the Peircean sense, but the Deleuze and Guattari will also have their own sense. But the abstract machine is defined as the diagram of the assemblage. So they say, at most, we may distinguish in the abstract machine two states of the diagram, one in which variables of content and expression are distributed according to their heterogeneous forms and reciprocal presupposition on a plane of consistency, and another in which it is no longer even possible to distinguish between variables of content and expression because the variability of that same plane has prevailed over the duality of forms, rendering them indiscernible. And this is the comment. They put it in parentheses, but it's important. The first state relates to still relative movements of deterritorialization, and the second, an absolute threshold of deterritorialization has been reached. So, the whole of Plateau 3 really laying out content and expression, and insofar as we understand stratification, there is a level at which we can reach absolute D, to speak it, that good absolute D, when content and expression have become indiscernible. All right, let's see. The third section, there are constants or universals of language that enable us to define it as a homogeneous system. We've talked a good deal about that, right? And how Deleuze and Guattari push back. And this is the part where they bring up music that you mentioned. Starts around page 95. I think their definition of style is great. Style can be the most natural thing in the world, is nothing other than the procedure of a continuous variation. And of course, it's for them, it goes back to their formula of n-1, right? Of creative subtraction is what they call it, right? And one of the things we're subtracting could be the constant or the supposed unity that would hold together a homogeneous system, because it's the one that is subtracted, right? n-1. So I think this is why the n-1 can be applied to the discussion we had about and is. Is the unity that glues together the sentence and gives it order, and is a power marker, and overthrows the unity of the is, plays the role of tensor, it's cutting edge. And then the fourth section, language can be scientifically studied only under the conditions of a standard or major language. Now, this obviously, all four of these support one another, all four of these statements, but the fourth one specifically is riding on the coattails of the last one, right? There's constants or universals that homogenize the system. That's the only way science can study it. Well, the political outcome of this means that we can only study a standard or major language. And that's because, to a certain extent now, politically and scientifically, what is stabilized and homogenized and is what's standardized, right? So the standard, the majoritarian, is the homogeneous. This is why they say, page 101, the unity of language is fundamentally political. And they do point out that in France, and they're not the only ones to do it. English had its own moments of we still use the phrase the Queen's or King's English, right? Even though there are variants, there's the American English variant, there's the UK English variants, and we could go on. There's Aussie English variants, but they do point out that France has, even with like one of the functions of the French Academy has been to try to
prevent
really
the Americanisms.
prevent the Americanisms from they mentioned franglais, right? Like the way that American English has. Well, I mean, this is probably still ongoing, although maybe less intense. But in the 90s, with the orthographic reforms in French in terms of spelling, and there were also these reforms to try to propose French words that would be standard replacements for English words that had become popularized. For example, the word bulldozer. Obviously, an American, or probably an American, but an English word. There were, so even to the extent of something as banal as that, as finding a noun substitute that a French could be proposed for. The problem with these things is that kind of top down from the French Academy proposing these alternatives that should be used more appropriately than English, is there's no way to make that stick unless it is organically, to use that word, quote unquote, organically, naturally taken up and utilized by everyday people, right? Sure, you could see it maybe try to infiltrate more academic language, because academic language does seem to want to follow the rules and procedures of good grammar and proper formal language than what you see in everyday speaking. But that too doesn't necessarily, that university discourse, to use like Lacan's terminology, doesn't necessarily have any grip on what is more currently in use and in vogue in a language.
Yeah, that would kind of fit well with Chomsky's notions of like performing language accurately, etc. But I was thinking, it's a lot of technology words like computer, mouse, etc. Because like, even in Spanish, they've adopted these very anglicized, like computadora for computer, calculators, calculadora. Obviously, those are like not. I don't want to say non-native Spanish, because that opens a whole can of worms in terms of theory, but like from the practical standpoint.
It is interesting that those two words you mentioned, a lot of English words, as we know, come from Latin and sometimes Greek, and then Latin itself romanticized a lot of Greek words that it inherited, not just the the gods of the pantheon were taken from Greek, but a lot of the words too. But so like words like computer and calculator have their root back in the shared uh, dead language, right? Which
Yeah.
is kind of interesting.
I mean, it's also even interesting in the sense that English is something like 60% French borrowing in
Well,
itself,
yeah, I
which
mean,
is
you had
the greater
the
irony of it all.
William the Conqueror, right? And the interesting thing is uh, the lingua franca, to use that word, right, which comes from, the universal language at the time would have been the Parisian French of the courts, whereas we were invaded by the Normans. And so it's interesting that even a minor language, what was it, in the 11th century, right? Even a minor language of William Conqueror, the Norman French, was what set about congealing and the constellations that would become middle and now modern English. So even there, it's interesting to think about the tension or interplay between the major standard
Yeah.
Parisian French of the courts versus the
The,
Norman French of the conquerors.
and then the English spoken by the peasants and what have you, because you have it's most notable in the food that I always, or that's where my mind always
Oh
goes
yeah,
to,
sure.
like pork, pig,
Hmm.
beef, cow, poultry, chicken, etc. Like very obvious distinctions there, but
Yeah,
that are
the
both
yeah.
wind up in English, in modern English, which is quite fascinating.
Hmm. Yeah, the
Now, one
uh
cool thing that they brought up too, or maybe they didn't bring this up, maybe I did this in secondary reading, was like looking at the Quebecois French, which is an even more like
they do reference Quebecois. They do.
wild kind of like, because it's really this hodgepodge of different of French and English and like looping back on themselves and doing
Yeah,
crazy shit.
and you've heard about, I think I may have told you this about the language laws that Quebec passed in the late 80s, early 90s. For example, on billboards, there had to be at least as much, but no less, amount of words and phrasings in French as in English. The French could not be in a smaller font, etc. So there had to be at least a parity, but obviously the implication was that the French would be more prominent. That's just one of the examples, but the whole question was, how are we going to continue in future generations funneling students towards schools that teach French primarily than the English schools? I mean, Quebec is it's a it's a it's an island of French and surrounded by a whole sea of English. And so it's not only, as they kind of point out, it's not only minorized in comparison to standard Parisian French, but it's also being bombarded on all sides by English variations, and not just the American English of, which still I think has a certain imperialist bent to the globe, but also Canadian French in its own minor mode from not just American English, but the Queen's English of because it's quote unquote a former colony or whatever. So all of that is a really interesting melting pot, to use the term that America used to be proud of, for the singular situation of Quebecois uh, French, and and it's interesting. I think that the language laws surrounding Quebec in the '90s really sediments drives home the point that perhaps seems obvious, but I think Deleuze and Guattari are like how the linguists seemingly fail to ignore this is the very political reality of of language, of not just language but major and minor languages, or major and minor modes of language, because there was a move, obviously, various moves, but a whole trend of moves juridically, politically, legislatively to try to keep French, Quebecois French, as the major uh, standard language. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess that's, you know, there's not two languages. There's a major and minor use and function. Um, and I guess one of the ways we can end off, since we we sort of have talked about a little bit of everything here, is and you pointed this out, and I think this is what you enjoyed, Coop. This is 105 towards the end of the plateau. The notion of minority is very complex with musical, literary, linguistic, as well as juridical and political references. The opposition is not simply quantitative. Um, Majority implies a constant of expression or content serving as a standard measure by which to evaluate it. Um, so the fact I think you enjoyed the fact that the musical reference was able to be brought out for you, and but I do think that it's important for them to say, look, it would be easy. And again, I think we could fall common sense could make us fall into the fact that we think of majority as numerical,
Right.
but
Yeah.
but that's not the case. I mean, we've seen in census studies, I think since you and I've been born, that yes, 50-50 men, women, but more or less, like if you really cut down to it fine grain, it's something more like 51% women, 49% men. It might be close, and maybe I'm misremembering, but if that were the simple case, that that power politically would shift because women were more numerous, obviously that would not stand
Right.
reason. And I mean, that's just a given. That makes it. It's very obvious when you state it that way, but it would be easy to fall back into this
Yeah.
idea of numbers winning out. Now they may have their own vector of shifting power to a certain extent, specifically when we get to questions of representation, questions of perhaps voting, etc., which is um, why issues like gerrymandering and these other things are obviously important. And the question, even the whole question about the 14 words and securing a future for white children, et cetera, still has uh, a question, because to a certain extent, sure, numbers dwindling could shift the majoritarian from adult white, uh, either men or just humans. But at least for now, that's, I mean, when we talk about white privilege, there's nothing else really being said than the majoritarian mode still, by and large, is around the same axes that Deleuze and Guattari pointed out, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
so
you've taken
yeah.
great care, I think, multiple times to point out that this is not necessarily tied to like size and so forth, but it really drove it home in a way that was more impactful to get the music
Mm, mhm.
analogy or what have you.
Well, you said one of your favorite bands, Midlake. They privilege the minor modes of music, and it does tinge the effective quality of listening to their music. It gives it something of a melancholic, but also a different affective
Yeah.
range than what you would hear from, you know,
I just like
most of the
melancholy
band.
music, period. Like I just prefer almost most of the music I like, I think is in minor scales.
Yeah, I told you, and I sent you the link, but I told you probably as a kid, the first minor mode that I can remember is The Legend of Zelda, the original NES game with that dungeon. Had you heard that before? Probably.
Oh, I'm sure. When I definitely
Yeah.
played that game.
The spooky dungeon music. But yeah, that's what I think of is but in any case, yeah, the I think that the minor mode is deprivileged and commercialized music, and I suppose for it has different it's a different function and usage of music to maybe use their way of thinking about the major and minor modes of language, right? It's a different use and function of music that implies a different affective tonality, um, which obviously doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just that it, at least so far as we can tell, it seems that the major mode is more saleable, right? It's more marketable. I suppose that wouldn't shock anyone to think about for a second. Um, yeah. So
Philosophy's to sadden, man. So that's the minor mode. I don't know. I'm joking, of course.
well, well, yeah. I we've talked about this before, and I do think that it's who is it saddening? I
Yeah.
think that's the question, right? Because I don't feel like Liz when he's reading Nietzsche. I don't think when he says philosophy's role is to sadden, I don't think he means that for everyone. I don't think he means that it's supposed to make everyone completely immiserated. I think that I think that the implication would be that those holding power or those who would themselves use sadness and misery and these other things to have power over others, those are the ones that need to be saddened. Those are the ones of which it can be said that philosophy's goal is to arm stupidity. I think that those, uh, the ones wielding power, uh, are the stupid ones that deserve to be saddened and brought down, which might be just another way of saying that the cutting edges of deterritorialization of becoming minoritarian is what's important about what they're laying out with continuous variation, rather than giving each minority its own majoritarian status. To a certain extent, that's the kind of language you would see from a Steve Bannon or an ethno-nationalist, where each minority can have their little slice and corner of the earth and be quote unquote separate but equal, or whatever the fuck, right? That seems to be maybe not the only way in which minorities would become major, but that seems like one possible outcome and one very real advocated outcome from certain political partisans.
They say Gilles Deleuze is fond of whispering sad ballads.
He's well, I'm trying to think. I'm wondering, he was in that movie
Yeah.
in the 80s. I have this strange desire to go see him, go watch his little flick and see how poorly or well he does. It just seems so funny. Just uh Deleuze and Guattari should have made some home movies, right? Should have should have should have done that. No, I don't. I wonder, but no, this is good, and I will say that this will immediately this plateau will immediately shed light on the next plateau, which will
What's the
be
next one?
the next one is on several regimes of signs, and so it follows up all of the what we've looked at here is going to have more payoff, and they're going to break down 4 different regimes of signs that they're going to want to look at. So 4 different quote unquote semiotics or semiotic systems.
Interesting. Is that going to go back towards 2 things that Deleuze discussed in Proustan signs? Because it was like the worldly signs,
yes,
I forget the others.
It will. It'll be obviously it'll be along different divisions, but in Proustan signs, you're right. So worldly signs, the signs of love, the signs of sensibility or sensible signs, and then the signs of art. So it's interesting that we have another tetravalence, right? We got the 4 worlds of Proust. We got the 4 semiotics in the next plateau. We've got the 4 valences of the assemblage. Maybe in order not to fall into a vulgarized Hegelianism of synthesis, thesis, antithesis, right? Like, gotta go by 4s, but
That's funny that you mentioned vulgar, because I was thinking about vulgar in the context of I don't know. I don't think it quite fit their examples, but I was kind of just thinking about how vulgar can mean, like it's used in these like vulgar Marxism or vulgar materialism versus like actual vulgarity that we commonly think of.
you mean in the sense of swear words and curse
Yeah.
words?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
just the way that we were like vulgarity or something being vulgar has like
Sure.
used in these contexts of like vulgar Hegelianism or vulgar materialism or vulgar Marxism, etc.
I
as
guess
a as a
I
different versus like what I think of. The first thing that comes to my mind with vulgar is that it's a curse.
right. And so and that has that's a kind of tradition, and each language has its own curse words, right? But that itself shows that there's an inheritance of a politically circumscribed set of words or phrases that are not polite to say, right? And good company, as we'd say. The other aspect of vulgar too, of course, could just be lewd, lascivious, right? And um, that itself too comes with convention, right? That we clothe ourselves and hide our genitals and our uh but the original sense of vulgar, and obviously I was using vulgar in the sense of kind of like a bastardized or watered down or betrayed Hegelianism. But the original sense of vulgar has to do with the commonplace, right? The
Like Latin Vulgate.
Like the Vulgate, which is meant to be, even though Latin, it would have been better than the Greek um, or the Aramaic and Hebrew, obviously, right? So the Vulgate would have been more quote unquote popular, or would have been more accessible to more people at the time because of Latin being the lingua franca. But even it's interesting that even the Greek of the Gospels is written in what's called Koine Greek, the common Greek, as opposed to like Attic or Doric Greek of Plato and others. So or I don't know, or you had the Ionian, the quote unquote classical uh, Greek. So yes, I I do think that I was only trying to give Hegel a little bit of props, because I know that reducing him
Yeah.
to the triads of the different theses and syntheses and whatnot is obviously ridiculous. Um, but in any case, yeah. So the regimes of science will be 4, and we it won't line up with the worldly, the amorous, the sensible, and
Gotcha.
the artistic. But it's interesting that you brought that out. Those different circles leading towards essence. in Proust and science. That's a good point to make. Something I'll have to think about when we move on to the next plateau.
Do you want to wrap up there?
Sounds good, buddy.
All right. That's going to wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all next week on another plateau.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.